have a conversation with you about different perspectives on wealth, because not all people have the same ideas about what wealth is. So this is kind of the Western view of wealth, right? You know, we've got the Lamborghini, we've got the cash, we've got the Rolex. You know, wealth is all about assets and money and income and all that sort of thing. So that's kind of a real post-industrial revolution perspective on commerce or on wealth. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, not a lot of people had a lot of assets. In fact, very few people had assets, so they didn't own their own homes and things like that. Quite often you would live on the farmlands that you worked for somebody else, so the housing was provided by the guy that you worked for. Or you lived in slum type areas in the cities, or that happened in the industrial period, and so you were working for the factory owners and things like that. So assets and cash and all that sort of stuff and this accumulation of wealth is a relatively new phenomena. So the Industrial Revolution started in the 1700s, the mid 1700s, and sort of continued on from there. But really it was post sort of the Second World War that consumerism and ownership of things really became important. That was the rise of marketing in the 50s and the purchasing of things to show, you know, that you own more things than the next door neighbour beside you. And the rise of television contributed quite heavily to that, because it meant that marketing could enter homes on a regular basis. So the way that Westerners perceive wealth is relatively new, and the accumulation of assets and the accumulation of things for the majority of people. For, you know, the upper elites, the 1%ers, it's always been about that. So, you know, but that used to be royalty. So pre-industrial revolution, it was kind of royalty and the high ups, whereas the majority of the population couldn't participate in that type of process. But let's talk about different perspectives. So the Indigenous people of Australia, they actually have a really different concept of how wealth works. So this is actually a report that was done. You can see the reference down here. There's a range of people involved, the University of New South Wales and the NAB. And they found that they found these things. I'll let you read that if you want to. But the most important thing I want to talk about is this last point here. For Indigenous people, you share everything with your kin. So your kin are people that are your blood relatives, your blood family, and then you move out of that into your tribe, and then you move further out into that. But the first thing you do is share with your family, and that's a really different mental space from compared to Western. It's not uncommon with nomadic people generally, so it's actually still a really common perspective in places of the Middle East where nomadic cultures are still prevalent, or not prevalent, but still quite recent. And that means that, you know, think about it, if you're a nomadic culture and you're moving from place to place to try and find food and water, as you are in deserts and as you are in Australia, it's really important to look after your family. It's really important to share everything you have with your family, because as human beings we want to make sure that our family exists and continues, right? Because it's all about the genetics and the flow on from that. So it's really important that that mental space exists in order to ensure that we continue. The problem is that when we have an Indigenous perspective of sharing with your family or your income, and that income is money, then you actually have an issue in relation to how it both helps and hurts financial resilience. So financial resilience is the ability to sustain yourself in the future financially. And the reason why it helps is obviously because you're helping your family members, but it also hurts because it means that you aren't personally accumulating your own wealth as an individual, because you're having to share it with everybody else. So the recommendations that came out of this report, it was quite a large report. If you want to go and have a look at it, they suggested that it's important that when we're looking at supporting Indigenous people in Australia, that we consider how their perspective works. And we consider that their idea and their value of wealth is quite different, and that we engage with that instead of just ignoring it. So, for example, some of the assistance that was given out in the 70s and early 80s to Indigenous people in the Northern Territory was, you know, we as Western culture, we like houses, you'll like houses, so we went out and built houses. But that wasn't what the Indigenous people actually wanted. And then the problem is that you can't build a 3-bedroom house, because then you can't share that with your whole family, because you can only have, you know, a limited number of people inside that house. Whereas if you've all got a campsite and you're sharing that campsite, it's much easier to share that with your whole extended family. So there was that lack of understanding of how wealth is valued and how assets are valued in the Indigenous people. We are getting better at it now, and obviously with reports like this, explaining to policymakers how the perspective actually works. Okay, so let's actually have a talk about how this works in relation to incentives. So with the Western culture and how commerce works, an incentive is if you work harder, I will pay you more. The problem is if you are, and that works on an individual basis if you're still accumulating individual wealth. The problem is that if you are sharing your wealth with everybody, then that's not much of an incentive, because you know that when you go home, it doesn't matter how hard you've worked, the pay packet that you've received will be shared with your family. And there was actually a farmer who had employed some Indigenous youths. So they were at-risk youths, and he'd employed them to do some picking of his fruit. Now, fruit picking is very hard work. It's seasonal work, so that means it only happens, a very short period every year, and it's very hard work. As you can see here, this person has been carrying that full of apples, so they go around, they pick them all by hand, and then they come in, empty them out, and start all over again. It's back-breaking work, it's terribly difficult. But what this farmer found was he found that he wasn't getting the output from the individuals that he wanted, and that was because they were going home and sharing their salaries. So there wasn't that incentive for each individual person to actually pick more apples. So what he did is he actually changed the incentive structure in such a way that he rewarded the individuals in a very, very different way. So as a result of that, the individuals started to adopt the Western culture of wealth. And so they started to hold their income. So what he was doing was paying them without showing the other people what they got paid. So each person had a private paycheck instead of him handing out the money at the end of the day. And what that meant was that they could not disclose to their family members what they were earning, and so they could start keeping it for themselves. And he found that this did increase productivity. But what that is it's a failure to recognise the sharing culture of the Indigenous peoples, and it overlays the Western value of wealth and money. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because as a farmer, you want people to work harder, and that is a natural incentive. But it is something that we, as social scientists, we're really interested in understanding that value judgment. And the other thing, of course, is there's a value judgment in relation to wealth further other than cultural. It's also, if you've been really, really sick for a long period of time, your value of wealth is going to be good health. So if you've been in a lot of pain for a long period of time and then all of a sudden you're not in pain, that is going to be the best thing in the world. Okay, and if you cast your mind back to when we looked at the Syrian refugee camps and what their needs and wants were, of course, if you've lived in extreme poverty and this has actually been your day-to-day existence, this is kids sorting through rubbish heaps, which happens in a lot of developing countries, then what happens is that you're very, very thankful for just the little bit of money that you can get. So your perception of wealth is very, very different again. So wealth is all about perspective. It's where you're sitting in the world. It's how much you already have before you start. But it also is a cultural perspective as well, right? So, and as social scientists, need to understand these different cultural perspectives in relation to wealth, and be careful or considerate about when we sit there and say, well, Western value for wealth is best. Because that's a value judgment, and we need to be conscious about what that means when we actually say that. And we need to understand how that impacts others.